You met our panelists earlier this evening. We have Fleming, Alexandra, and Dr. Metz. And we're going to start with Alexandra. So you mentioned that you first learned of Hedy Lamarr from Blazing Saddles. How did you get from there to here?
That's not enough. So I had been doing a series on inventors for 2 years. And so it had given me the time to do a really deep dive into who invents our world and how does that happen? What does it look like? And how do we respond to those inventors? How do we respect them? And I was really looking at inventors today, but all right. I was really looking at inventors today for this series, but the interesting thing was so many of the diverse inventors, women, people of color, were telling me that it was very difficult for them to get funding, that they had a difficult time in Silicon Valley getting people to take them seriously. We've heard this story now. We know this story. But the problem was people didn't think of inventors looking the way they did, these women and people of color. And so they were having a hard time getting anyone to take them seriously in funding their projects. And it sort of fired up this question in me, who did create our world? Was it really just one type of person? Could that really be possible? And I think with Hidden Figures, we began to answer that question. That it wasn't created by one kind of person. But this story was also, I hoped, a beginning in answering that question. There are people who created our world who we've forgotten for a reason. And unless we find those stories and put them out there, I don't think they get resurrected. And we don't start to realize that our diverse and incredible world was created by a diverse and incredible group of people. So I started this company with my brother and the actress Susan Sarandon called Reframe Pictures, and a wonderful producer that we were working with at the time, Catherine Drew, came to us with a book called Hetty's Folly by Richard Rhodes that the Sloan Foundation had funded. And it was in 2011, and her story was really starting to come out. Now, there were still a lot of unanswered questions in there, and it was a really exciting book to read, because not just because of what was in it, but because of what I still wanted to answer. And my background is as an investigative journalist. So I wanted to answer, for starters, how would Hetty respond to all of these questions about how she invented? Did she really steal the idea from her munitions husband? Did George Antheil do most of the inventing? I mean, these things were not fully resolved when I began working on this film, so it was a really exciting challenge.
Do you think those things are resolved now?
For me, they are. I don't think we try and dictate that for the viewer, but having done a really deep dive into this, and having been pretty rigorous myself on the standard at which I wanted to answer those questions, I can confidently say she was the genius behind this. And there was an insight I had making the film, which was that, like artists, inventors can be divided into two categories. There is the person who has this kind of genius idea, the concept person. But like a lot of conceptual art today, Damien Hirst, he's not necessarily the guy who does the formaldehyding. So there's also the person who executes. And so that was a light bulb moment for me when I realized that Hetty was the one with the concept and George was the one who was executing and taking the notes. And we want to give George the credit because the notebooks are in his hand, but actually all the letters that we could find in the archive give Hetty all the credit. She's the one with the ideas, she's dictating things, and he's taking notes. And so for me, that answers it. Why would George, he's telling people in personal letters, his wife is telling people in personal letters. They didn't have any motive to do that. So that answered it for me.
And he says the same thing in his book.
You want to use my mic? Yeah.
He says the same thing in his book, Bad Boy of Music. There's a chapter where he says he worked on it, but it was all her idea.
So Fleming, you had a critical role in bringing Hetty to us all and through the film with those interviews that you did and those tapes that you had hidden behind your blue garbage pail, which is fascinating. How did you get to interview her, and why were those tapes sort of hidden away, and for how long?
Okay, that's two questions. My father was an astrophysicist. He was at MIT, and he had lunch with a friend of his who was a specialist in codes, deep codes, and his friend had, while he was writing about different types of codes, and he'd come across the patent, the Hedy Lamarr patent, and this was in the early 80s, and he tracked her down and he talked to her about it, and he got his ideas, which turned out not to be exactly the same as my ideas. But my father then called me and said, let me tell you this story. And when he got through telling it, he says, would that interest you? Do you think Forbes would be interested in that? And then I had to figure out a way to make Forbes interested in that. Make it a story about that had a Forbes angle. And the Forbes angle was, it's not enough to be innovative. It's not enough to have brilliant ideas. You have to promote your ideas. And so that was the thin thread that I hung it on.
And when Alex contacted you about your tapes, what did you think about handing them over for this film, and how that might bring another voice to Hedy Lamarr?
Well, Alex, what did I say when I gave you the tapes?
First thing Fleming said was, I've been waiting 25 years for you to call me.
Yeah, there was nothing that I was going to do with the tapes, but I knew that there was something precious about them, and that, I throw away a lot of stuff, not enough, but I couldn't bear to throw that away, even though I didn't know why, and I found out why.
So, Dr. Metz, what's important about Hedy Lamarr's role as a scientist and as a woman scientist and an inventor, then and even today?
Thanks. I think the one thing that really resonates is that she wasn't taken seriously. And that's a situation that is very common today. But things are changing, and women lacked strong female role models, particularly in their fields. And that was detrimental as well, and it continues to be detrimental. I mean, women make up the faculty, 38% of the faculty at most major universities and medical centers, but yet only 13% of them become leaders and full professors. But things are changing. In fact, at the Feinstein, we have a group called Advancing Women in Science and Medicine, and our underlying ideology is women helping women, which is something women are really good at. And you could see some of the things that would happen in Hetty's life if she had all of the support that other women would have. Her mother wasn't American, made it more difficult for her, and she wasn't educated here and didn't have those role models.
Do you think movies like Hidden Figures and films like this are helping to change that, and what kind of impact will they have?
It's amazing. I'm a scientist, and I didn't know anything about the women of NASA, the mathematician women of NASA, and I felt like I was robbed. Why didn't people tell me about it? I mean, I didn't seek out the information myself either, but it was really sad to realize that I was never, it wasn't in the history books. These things weren't highlighted. Rewrite the history books, right? Who writes the history books, unfortunately.
Right.
It's a common problem.
So you have to write a book now. Fleming, when you spoke to Hetty, how would you categorize her? Was she bitter? Was she happy with her life?
She was quite bitter because she thought she deserved more. She thought she deserved recognition, and recognition for her included money. In fact, every time I spoke to her, she asked me if the Forbes family would come up with some money. Will you please? And I said, they're not going to do that. I'm not. I can try, but I'll tell you, they're not going to do that. And so she asked me each time, and then one time, I had just moved into a really crummy sublet apartment because I was newly single. And it had no furniture. The phone had just been installed. It was a Saturday morning. I was getting up and I was going to go across town to the Lincoln Center Library of Performing Arts because that was the only library in New York that had a copy of George Anthile's book. And there was no Amazon, no nothing like that. So while I was getting ready to go, my phone rang, which was shocking to me because I didn't even know what my phone number was. I certainly hadn't given it to anyone else. And so when I picked up the phone, I hear, "Mr. Meeks, it is Miss Lamarr." And she had another brainstorm. She had another brainstorm about how she could get some money. She said, "Well, if they won't pay me, maybe they'll buy me a car." And I said, "Miss Lamarr, I don't think that's not going to work. I'm sorry, I don't think it's going to work." He said, "Well, you have to be persuasive." And so I said, "Miss Lamarr, you would know more about that than me. What do you suggest?" And she said, "Well, you can tell them she wants a Jaguar, but she'll settle for a Lincoln."
She seemed to have quite a sense of humor in her.
She did. She did.
Alex, I think that I was told or read, or you might have told me that her children were at the premiere of the film. What did they
Yes.
think of it?
That was a mystery to me before the premiere. I mean, they had been heavily involved, but any journalist will tell you you don't show someone who's in the film any cuts the film before it goes out because that could really affect the end product. In many ways you can't predict. So it was very difficult for the kids to let me have that kind of power over their mother's story, having been so badly burned with Ecstasy and Me, especially Dee Dee. So I ended up calling her and telling her every shot in the movie verbally so she could visualize it. And that gave her enough confidence to come to the Tribeca premiere. So she was on one side of me and Anthony was on the other, and they were both kind of clutching at my arm. And I had no idea. I was totally terrified what their response would be. I didn't think we pulled any punches. At the same time, I didn't think we'd been unfair, but I had no idea. And as the music began and everything started in the film, Anthony started punching me in the leg, which I thought was very bad. And it was really bruised by the end. But he was crying, actually, when the lights came up, and so was Dee Dee. And they both kind of hugged me, and they hugged each other. And that was interesting because they weren't speaking to each other. And they had their children there, and their children were crying. And then we all went out to dinner afterwards, and they said, we felt like we got our mother/grandmother back because we didn't understand all the parts of her story. Like, we only understood that she was pushing us away. We only understood that there was a drug problem and there was scandal. But they hadn't put it all together into a narrative in their own heads. And I think there was a moment of reconciliation in the family because it kind of helped them with some old wounds to see it all in a narrative. And that really was fantastic to hear. But also, they've now gotten behind the film and they take it to different festivals and they do Q&As like this. Dee Dee's just done one in Nashville yesterday. Anthony's just done one in Hot Springs and all over the country. I mean, it's unbelievable.
It's wonderful. You mentioned cutting. So was there anything left on the cutting room floor during the process? Anything that you want to share?
You must be in journalism to ask that question. It's such a good question. Yeah, there's so much on the cutting room floor with this film. I like to say there's a second film on the cutting room floor. Her life was like Forrest Gump's life. She intersected always with history in these unusual, wild ways. But unlike Forrest Gump, she also wanted to affect history and often did. So it's just, you can't believe the things you keep discovering. I'll give you an example. She was targeted by Charles Manson. Manson had a list of 41 celebrities he wanted to kill, and she was one of them. And the FBI came to her house and said, "You probably better go for a while." And at that time, she was getting a little paranoid that people wanted bad things for her anyway, because that's when the tabloids really started going after her. And she had that realized by this, moment with Manson. Everything from that to Robert Osborne. We have amazing Robert Osborne stories we weren't able to get in there. And this was his very last interview you just saw, 2 weeks before he died. He came in to do this last interview, and he was freezing cold, and we were giving him tea the whole time, and he told me he had a little cold, and that's why he was in a wheelchair suddenly. And I didn't know how sick he was, but I kept saying maybe we should stop this interview. And he was insistent that no, he must tell her whole story because he needed to do right by his friend Hetty. And I'll tell you, his one thing that's on the cutting room floor that was not ready for prime time, but you might enjoy, is that Robert Osborne said, do you know what kind of a friend she was to me? And I said, no, tell me. And he said, well, as a young man, I had terrible bags under my eyes, and I looked strange. And she said to me, you're not going to make it looking like that. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad tidings, but it's true. You're going to have to do something about those bags under your eyes. And he said, you mean plastic surgery? And she said, yeah. And he said, well, I can't afford that. That's ridiculous. And so Hetty went home and thought about that for a while. And there was a plastic surgeon she'd always had kind of a crush on. So she searched him out. She started an affair. And she said the condition was that he do her friend Robert Osborne's eyes right away. And he did it. And Robert Osborne said, it made my career. She made my career with this crazy decision. But this is so Hetty. This great good deed she did is so X-rated, I can't put it in the film. So.
Just like ecstasy, right?
Yeah, just like ecstasy.
So Fleming, was she hesitant to talk to you? Did you have to convince her, or did she just, I mean, she seemed so interested. She was so removed from so many people in her life. How did you get her to talk to you?
Well, my father's friend, and he's Robert Price, he's in there, and he's sort of the villain of the film. But he introduced me. I mean, he set her up so that when I called her, she was willing to talk to me. And she spent a lot of time trying to get off the phone. You know, initially it was very, very difficult to keep her talking. But I needed, I needed to get what I needed for my story, and I had to keep pushing for that because she would start talking and then she would just go into another subject and another subject and another subject. She would always come back, and so if you put the different things she was saying together, it was then coherent. And beyond that, a journalist always wants more, but on top of that, I was talking to Hedy Lamarr, and why would I want to stop? It's not like, well, I got my quote, thanks a lot. And so I just kept calling her back and calling her back. And I called her one time, I think it was about 6:30 at night, and she was really mad at me because I was interrupting her game shows. And she hung up on me, and she said something to the effect of, I don't want to talk to you again, which was problematic because we had fact checkers, and somebody had to call her and go over the things that were in the story. So I thought, okay, so how am I gonna fix this? So I sent her a dozen roses, and that's what you hear when you first hear her voice when she says, "Thank you for the roses." We were friends again.
Roses always work. So I have one more question I'm going to ask Dr. Metz, and then if any of you have questions, we'll have time for some quick questions from the audience. So in the film, Hetty had some people who were helpful and supported her in a way, like Howard Hughes, but she didn't really have a true mentor. How important is that for scientists, and also, to have the kind of support of a Howard Hughes who says, I believe in you, and anything you need, you can come here, and my team will help you. Did that make a difference in her life, and how important is that for scientists and for women scientists?
It's hugely important. Creates an environment where women can excel. Confidence is a major aspect that women need to work on and can catapult them from a mediocre scientist into an amazing scientist. And it's the same as a champion, whether it's a man or a woman, and creating an environment where women scientists can excel will make or break situations. And clearly medicine, research we do today becomes the medicine that will be in a decade from now, the therapies, the diagnostics, the prevention measures. And like you said earlier, that diversity is so important. Diversity in research is critically important for understanding human disease, because we're not going to treat one select group of patients. We're really treating all, and that's really the goal.
How does Hetty stack up as a scientist and her contributions to science and technology? I mean, where would you put that in terms of other scientific discoveries and inventions?
I think she's way up on the totem pole after seeing the movie, and I really admire her persistence. Clearly having support from financial support from Howard Hughes was, I'm sure, very fundamental for her success. And I think that if people did take her seriously, she would have been well recognized in her day for what she had done. And I think she's right up there with several Nobel laureates. I hate to say that, but I think it's really true. In fact, we were talking earlier when we came in, I looked up the numbers since I think 1901, when Nobel Prizes were given out. Over 800 men have received the Nobel Prize, and about 40-something women have received Nobel Prizes. And the first woman was Marie Curie, who received the Nobel Prize. In fact, she received 2 Nobel Prizes, by the way. And she first received one only a couple years after Nobel Prizes were given out. So it's not that all these 40-some-odd Nobel Prizes were only given in the last couple of years. It's just not true. They've been sprinkled over the entire time. And I think one of the blogs that I saw before coming here tonight was that we should give tribute to all the brilliant women who haven't been recognized. And truly, this is inspiring to do something like that.
So do we have any questions from the audience? I think we have some microphones.
I really love the film, thank you, and it was terrific. Were there any particular nemesis that you could especially name in the media who really went after her or made their bones on going after her, and in a specific sense, and what motivations might there have been for this specific person or persons?
Yeah, it's a sad answer. The National Enquirer really went after her. There was a goat, a 2-headed goat that was born when she first starts doing the plastic surgery that was called Hedy Lamarr. And the press got a real field day out of that. She was so ugly now that she was like this 2-headed goat. It was mainly about her looks. It was this, this film is really about power and being a woman. And what that shows me is how eager the press was to take her down from her pedestal as soon as she started losing her beauty. Like, just smash it to smithereens. And that is a very violent act for a woman like that to withstand. And they wanted to take her power. And we can all judge her for trying to keep it by doing all that plastic surgery. But if you experienced an attack that violent, wouldn't you also try to fight back? And what did she have to fight back? She had her inventive mind. So she invented plastic surgeries, So part of me is sad about that, but part of me kind of is proud of her for trying.
Does anyone know how the Austrian people feel about Hedy Lamarr?
Yeah, I can take that one. It's a mixed bag. So this is National Inventors Day because of her. She has been honored recently. We actually helped crowdfund a tomb of honor for her, but the Austrian government helped us, which is 88 frequency balls that when you walk past them resolve into her face. It's a sculpture. And people visit that tomb now in the Austrian cemetery. On the other hand, this film has been picked up across Europe, Australia, India. It's going to China, but not Austria. And we don't know why. But I think it may be partly this complicated relationship with the past. The government that's just been elected has swung further right. And I don't think it's a moment that Austria is ready to embrace this woman, which is really tragic to me, really sad. I hope it turns around. I hope Austria comes around and watches this film. I just took the film to Germany and had an amazing response from the audiences there. They are totally embracing of Hetty and love this story and want to talk about why she wouldn't come back to Austria and want to talk about the Nazi thing. They're into it. They want to have that dialogue. Austria, not yet.
Another question here? Yep, right here in front.
Alex, I have a few questions. The first one is, when will it be on the big screen here? Number two, I noticed that there, some of the storytellers, one of them, Janine Basinger, was that your decision or was that somebody else's decision? Is Wesleyan involved with that? Is it in the archives there? And number three.
Are you from Wesleyan?
No, I had a child.
Yeah, it's a great college.
A child that went there.
You have a child at Wesleyan. Well, Janine
No,
Basinger
wait, yeah.
is a legend
Right.
outside of Wesleyan as well. I mean, she is. You cannot find right now a film historian that is more well respected
And she
than
was a
Janine
film
Basinger.
graduate.
Yeah. So I went to her because of her reputation,
That's what I
and
thought.
because she's very funny on camera. You know that moment where she's like, "You can't be beautiful and smart." No, no. It's fantastic.
And the other question I wanted to ask, maybe I misunderstood, did her granddaughter say that she had only actually been in her
Yes.
presence twice?
You did not misunderstand. That's how reclusive Hetty became. Her granddaughter saw her twice because Hetty was actually very present in her life, but it was through the telephone. Because she really felt that people would be so shocked at her looks that I think she felt she didn't want to deal with that, even with her own family. And that's what was making her granddaughter cry in that clip, was that idea that she had been so ashamed of herself that she couldn't have an in-person relationship anymore. And this was her favorite grandchild. I mean, she talked a lot about Lodi on the tapes, but she just couldn't be near her, which is really tragic. What was your first question again? Oh, when is it coming to theaters? Thank you. That's a really good one. So actually, this film is coming to New York City for its theatrical premiere on November 24th, the day after Thanksgiving. It has a week in New York City and a week in LA booked. Dependent on how it does in those 2 weeks, it will get rolled out across the country. So actually, you have a lot of power in this room because you've seen it early. And if you give it, some reviews on Facebook, if you talk about it on social media and help people know it's coming to New York, we have a far better chance. The hashtag is Hetty the movie. The Facebook is at BOMBSHELL the movie, at BOMBSHELL the movie.
And it also will air on PBS nationwide next year on American Masters.
Yeah, but we're not telling people that yet because we want
Okay.
them to go to theaters.
Yes, go to the. I agree. Go to the movies. Don't wait. But we want to thank our panelists and all of you for being here tonight, and the Gold Coast International Film Festival for bringing us this fabulous film. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.